Mr Medic.
Thank you, President. I lay on the table the Statement of Compatibility with the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act 2006.
Thank you, Mr Medic.
I move that the bill now be read a second time.
Continue. Yeah, you can read your
Thank you.
second.
In 1985, a Channel 9 cameraman was alerted to the slaughter of native water birds happening on Victorian wetlands. Intrigued, he visited Lake Conowari, a Ramsar wetland of international importance and in my own electorate of Western Victoria, and the campaign to ban recreational duck shooting was born. At the time, there were over 100,000 registered duck shooters in Victoria, and just 15 rescuers headed out to the wetlands to rescue injured birds and provide them with veterinary treatment or humane euthanasia. According to a ballistics expert, it's estimated that at least 1 in 4 ducks shot by shooters will not die instantly, meaning they can suffer for days or even weeks on end before drowning or succumbing to infection or predators. Rescuers aimed to alleviate this suffering as much as they could. Joan Kirner was the Conservation Minister at the time the campaign started and changed the law immediately when she was alerted that wildlife officers could legally shoot ducks at the same time they were regulating shooters. This came about after one wildlife officer stated it was normal for protected species to be illegally shot, and that morning he'd shot 8 game species, but 4 had gotten away while wounded. It's interesting reflecting back on events that could totally change the course of where we are today. 31 years ago, in 1988, Kirner became prepared to ban duck shooting, but only if the New South Wales government did at the same time. Much negotiation went on at the time, and the then Premier of New South Wales, Barry Unsworth, seemed prepared to do it. Campaigners speak of the moment they waited in Kirner's office to find out the outcome. When Kirner's staff came in to apologise, that New South Wales had pulled out at the last minute. Just 7 years later, in 1995, under Labor Premier Bob Carr's leadership, duck shooting was banned in New South Wales. Carr still speaks proudly of this decision, writing in his blog years later, "I was in a Collins Street coffee shop early one morning, dispatching an espresso. A guy at the bar said to me, 'You stopped me shooting ducks.' I was reminded that I did precisely that, banning duck hunting in my first term. 'Sorry,' I said, 'I'm on the side of the ducks.'" And last month, Carr spoke out again, calling for a ban on duck shooting in Victoria and telling the government there will be no negative response. In a letter penned to Daniel Andrews, he said, "Duck shooting is not a sport, and the slaying of waterfowl is not a measure of human skill." I agree. Just like Carr did in New South Wales, other Labor governments have banned duck shooting. In fact, the Labor government in Western Australia in 1990 was the very first to do so. Carmen Lawrence was Premier at the time and said, "There is widespread opposition throughout the community to the cruelty and environmental damage caused by shooters. Evidence from previous seasons shows that injured ducks have been left to die. Protected species have been shot and fragile wetlands have been polluted by lead and cartridges. Our community has reached a stage of enlightenment and where it can no longer accept the institutionalised killing of native birds for recreation." Then in 2005, the Labor government in Queensland went on to do the same. The then Premier Peter Beattie said, "There will be no more duck and quail hunting in Queensland. It's time to ban the recreational shooting of ducks and quail. This is not an appropriate activity in contemporary life in the smart state." This initiative was also debated in this chamber in 2011, The Leader of the Opposition in this House committed to support as many humane outcomes as can occur in this public policy space. Yet here we are in 2019, with arguably the most progressive government in the country, and duck shooting continues. And in my opinion, we shouldn't even be having this debate. In 1990, the Victorian Labor State Conference voted overwhelmingly to ban it. In 91, Victoria's Labor Country Caucus voted to ban it. Dozens of branches have voted to ban it. In 2013, Labor's Conservation, Environment and Resources Policy Committee voted to ban it. To use an old Labor saying, it's time. When duck shooting is banned, and when I say when, not if, the shooters will likely say their rights are being taken away. But what about the rights of our native wildlife to finally live peacefully in their own homes? What about the rights of all Victorians to enjoy our iconic and tranquil wetlands? The rights of First Nations people to preserve their culture, history and land. The reality is, traditions change. They always have. And if a tradition is wrong or outdated, it's time for it to go. They'll probably also claim they are true conservationists, but it doesn't pass the pub test. Although some duck shooters have worked to rehabilitate wetlands, the aim is to attract and breed ducks simply so they can kill them. Conservation is done as a selfless act to restore the environment and to encourage the restoration of life, not as an act of selfishness to ensure you can continue to kill. Conservation and duck shooting are, without a shadow of a doubt, very mutually exclusive terms. The so-called economic benefits of duck shooting have been roundly criticised by numerous experts too. An economic analysis by the Australia Institute in 2012 showed that claims of duck shooting contributing significantly to the economy in Victoria are completely false. In monetary terms, revenue from non-hunting tourism is far more important and is actually negatively impacted by hunting. In associated terms, they estimate the benefit of banning duck hunting at around $60 million per year, a conservative estimate. I also hear shooters and authorities defending duck shooting through the supposed benefit of tourism, a very confusing message when contrasted by the lived experience of regional land and business owners. The Sydney-based kayak company responsible for the Murray River Paddle has recently stated that they will avoid further trips to Victorian wetlands, despite previously touring Gunbower Island and the Murray River down to Kahuna. Their concern? The safety of their clients and their liability for accidents. When school groups and duck shooters are asked to share waterways, it's the students that lose out. Forced to share the peak season with shooters, this group, like many, question the legitimacy of a recreation which serves so little to the community. Another resident tells us, and I quote, "It's never been lucrative, just ask the local store." So that's exactly what I did. In a phone call to a caravan park situated in the heart of one of the most popular shooting locations, I was informed that no shooters, to the knowledge of that park, had stayed in over 2 years of ownership. They did, however, raise a concern for a decline in visitation from our rescuers. With that in mind, I make it my promise that we will continue to visit these magnificent wetlands as they make their transition back to safe areas for tourists and animals. It is in fact the potential for increase in nature-based tourism that these local businesses have looked forward to. Research by Tourism Research Australia has found 50% of people avoid regional towns during the duck shooting season. Some councils are taking the frustration of this into their own hands, with the Mount Alexander Shire being one of them. Just this year, they passed a motion to condemn duck shooting on Cancurran due to the impact it has on the various recreational activities enjoyed on their wetlands. One of the problems with duck shooting is that it is so hard to regulate and police, and shooters know this. There are literally thousands of sites across Victoria where shooters are allowed to kill ducks, making the task of being present almost impossible for enforcement agencies like the Game Management Authority. The community's expectation, and rightly so, is that when you have people on the wetlands using weapons designed with one purpose, to kill violently, then every single one of those wetlands should be monitored while shooting is allowed. Every single one, every single hour. Clearly, this would require enormous resources and investment. Consequently, these wetlands are largely ignored. Throughout the decades, the role of highlighting poor behaviour from shooters has fallen on volunteers and not-for-profit organisations rather than the regulator. However, even the Game Management Authority's presence at a wetlands is not an antidote to the recklessness that duck shooters engage in. We only have to cast our minds back to 2017, when over 1,000 birds were massacred and buried whole at the Corangi Marshes near Kerang. Trigger-happy shooters shot well over their bag limits and unleashed mayhem across the wetlands, leaving behind a trail of destruction at what is an internationally recognised wetland of importance under the Ramsar Convention. 183 illegally shot and threatened species were recovered by volunteers, and over 10,000 spent shotgun cartridges were retrieved. However, all of this took place right in front of officers from the GMA, fisheries and police who were powerless to stop it given the scale on which it was occurring. The enforcement of duck shooting is even further hampered by the fact there are only 5 compliance officers across the entire state, and they are prohibited from talking to an armed shooter without a police officer present, thereby taking away limited police resources from small country towns. As shooters get away with killing protected and threatened species such as the freckled duck, one of the rarest water birds in the world, or they get away with shooting over their bag limit, they simply become emboldened, and it breeds a culture of recklessness and lawlessness, which is what we saw in 2017. The Corangi Marshes massacre wasn't the first we saw, and it certainly won't be the last while duck shooting continues. I draw your attention to another mass killing of protected birds known as the Box Flat massacre, which occurred under the previous Liberal National Government in 2017 when Peter Walsh in the other place was the Minister for Agriculture. It was on private land right in the Minister's electorate. It was aptly described by the Weekly Times' Chris McLennan as an orgy of killing, one of the worst wildlife massacres Victoria had seen. Swans, coot, grebe, rare and defenceless birds, game fowl, between 1,000 and 2,000 water birds. An investigation was launched, but the offenders were never identified. Game officers had attended on the day of the massacre, but weren't witness to the indiscriminate destruction of wildlife taking place. It was later that the extent of what had just taken place would become apparent. It was also revealed that there had been forewarning that this was about to happen. The Wednesday before opening, Games officers were warned something may happen at Box Flat. So how can we really expect that duck shooting will ever be conducted responsibly or adequately enforced after one of the worst massacres of native wildlife, of especially protected and threatened species, didn't lead to a single prosecution, where Games management had been forewarned, had attended on the day, had interviewed witnesses following the discovery of masses of birds that had been deliberately hidden? The cold, hard fact is it can't. And again, so appropriately summarised in the above-mentioned opinion piece, Box Flat is now a sorry part of hunting history. Perhaps there was never anything the government could do to ensure it will not happen again. The minister never released the report. The only thing the government can do to ensure it won't happen again is to legislate that the killing of native water birds for recreational entertainment shall not happen again in any circumstance. Water birds aren't just killed outright on the wetlands, it's also unavoidable that a significant number of them are wounded by shotgun pellets. It's unavoidable because no matter how good the shooter, and many of them are not good, The spread of shot that literally defines this type of gun ensures that the number of pellets hitting a bird is somewhat random, and they may end up with just a few shots entering their body. These pellets hit them randomly in their beaks, their head, wings, body and legs. So often birds are maimed but survive long enough to escape immediate capture and death at the hands of a shooter, but they die slowly of their wounds over days and weeks subsequent. Their dead bodies sometimes washing up together in the reeds at the side of lakes. Along with wounding so-called game birds, shooters regularly shoot and kill or wound protected species such as the freckled duck and blue-winged shoveler, not to mention avocets, swans, ibis and myriad other Australian bird species that end up shot. It is unacceptable to find that species of birds known to be endangered are further threatened by shooting, even if both the shooter and the government shrug their shoulders and say, "Whoops, it was an accident." It's time to recognise that the recreational shooting of native water birds is simply no longer acceptable to the majority of Victorians. Historical polls have shown up to 85% of Victorians support a ban. In 2010, a petition was presented to the government in a joint effort by the RSPCA and the Coalition Against Duck Shooting, showcasing 30,000 signatures. This was before the time of e-petitions, and each individual signature from Victorian constituents was collected and checked by hand. The National Firearm Agreement requires a minimum age of 18 for the use and licensing of guns in Australia. Despite this, children as young as 12 who are not required to sit a waterfowl identification test make up shooter numbers each year. Medics for Gun Control recently stated, and I quote, "Any government that supports or facilitates the use of guns by children is acting against their obligation to Australia's national gun safety laws." Shooters have never been required to sit a shooting accuracy test to legally obtain a firearms licence in Victoria. In 2011, a female rescuer was shot by hunters. The 9 pellet fragments removed from her face demonstrate the wounding potential of these weapons. And then there's the other intentional harm. Sexual harassment, verbal abuse and property damage are reported to me by constituents, many of whom have complained first to the GMA to no avail. Shotguns pointed at and poked into the chests of activists, tyres slashed and vehicles rolled over. The list goes on. And what about families with homes near waterways, forced to listen to and experience the consequence of gunfire for 2 months of the year? Continuously, public sentiment has been the same between the city and the country. The overwhelming majority want a ban. In fact, a recent survey, regional Victorians were given the chance to speak out. This is just some of what they said. Firing across the boundary with shotgun pellets striking the house. One occasion saw a family member struck. Trespassing on my workplace is common. We reinforce the fences, but they still enter. We've been told there's nothing we can do. Outrageous that we as landowners seem to have no rights. I've been making complaints for 20 years. Overwhelmingly, the authorities don't respond, and when they do, they aren't interested. Children are horrified, particularly when they come across unclaimed bodies. We are constantly tired during duck shooting, and guns scare our granddaughter, and our dog is terrified. A witness in the recent inquiry into animal activism on Victorian farms has recounted that, while carrying on their farming, they were never worried about activists, but they were terrified about trespass by armed duck shooters. And let this serve as yet another example of our continued disregard for sacred Indigenous land. I was taken on a tour of Lake Bort recently by honorary caretaker Paul Hoare. Walking through what was once tranquil and flourishing wetland, now devastated by drought, it remains home to the largest population of scar trees in Victoria. All around me was pointed out evidence of disturbed burial grounds, cooking mounds and ancient cultural significant trees, chopped down for firewood. And to my dismay, even toilets at the campsites of shooters. Ancient cooking beads lying side by side with empty shotgun pellets and human excrement. An absolute disgrace. Back in 2009, South East Australia had been in drought for over 10 years. The so-called Millennium Drought saw continuing hot and dry conditions in southeastern Australia. Its effects were exacerbated by Australia's then second hottest year on record in 2009, with record-breaking heat waves in January, February and the second half of the year. Melbourne's water supplies dipped to 27%, despite tight and damaging Stage 3A water restrictions. The government commenced construction on one of the world's largest desalination plants. Farmers were walking off the land and there was a significant spike in mental health problems associated with the drought. In steps the Field and Game Association. Their Gippsland spokesperson is caught red-handed stealing water for their private wetland. Perhaps my crossbench colleague should decide whether he supports farmers growing crops or shooters growing ducks, because they both can't use the water. In the dying days of the unstable and dysfunctional Napthine government, legislation was enacted to create the Game Management Authority, and it has inherited all of the characteristics of that government: confusion, waste and cruelty. Because duck shooters continue to behave unlawfully, and the GMA seem impotent to stop them. They ended up asking Pegasus Economics to undertake an independent review to evaluate the authority's compliance and enforcement regime, the appropriateness of its operating model and its capacity and capability to deliver its compliance and enforcement obligations. Unfortunately, the Pegasus Economics report found that the GMA has not been able to effectively fulfil its compliance and enforcement responsibilities. Non-compliance with the game hunting laws is commonplace and widespread. The GMA is widely perceived by its external stakeholders and its own staff as unable either to ensure compliance with the game hunting laws or to effectively sanction offenders when those laws are breached. This has seriously undermined its credibility as an independent and effective regulator and raises questions about the integrity and sustainability of the regulatory regime, and that the game hunting laws are widely perceived by internal and external stakeholders to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to effectively enforce in the field. Perhaps that is why even one of the peak law bodies has written to the Premier and Ministers advising that they are concerned that those protections that do exist in the regulations will not be adequately enforced by the GMA in spite of the commitment to increase funding, and they call for the government to commit to banning duck hunting in 2020. A law that cannot be effectively policed and enforced is a bad law. Perhaps that is why their own head of enforcement quit the organisation in disgust and proceeded to blow the whistle on their impotence and unwillingness to prosecute shooters. My involvement with this issue does not run for anywhere near as long as so many of those who have been involved. I ran my election campaign on this issue, and it speaks to the very heart of what I and my party fight against. There is something completely brutal, so intrinsically barbaric, about blasting innocent and unsuspecting waterbirds to death for fun. It is this outrageous injustice, this wholesale festival of blood, that speaks to my sense of standing up against cruelty wherever I am able. These birds need protection, not destruction. They are worthy of our admiration, and I will fight for them. I have played my part for a mere 8 years, but it has been one of the most brutal campaigns I've been involved in. I have witnessed physical harassment and intimidation, not just of rescuers, but of police. Tyres slashed and verbal and online abuse. As I said earlier, there were once 100,000 registered duck shooters in Victoria. This number has continued to rapidly decline, with less than 0.4% of the population being registered to take part in duck shooting, and even less actually doing so. This year it was estimated a mere 1,300 took part in opening weekend. A well-known rescuer said over 20 years ago, the defenceless birds who don't have teeth, much less a voice to defend themselves, have committed allies interrupting the firing lines. The guns are turning, and a media spotlight is exposing the shooters who for 200 years have harassed, wounded and maimed small birds away from the public eye. And I know that Victoria's native water birds and our beautiful wetlands have more allies in Parliament than just myself. It's time for us to ban duck shooting. Thank you.